In May 1898, the United States Navy destroyed the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay in a battle that lasted just a few hours. By August, American forces had taken Manila. The Spanish-American War in the Philippines appeared to be over, a quick and decisive American victory that cost relatively few lives and established the United States as a Pacific power. But that conventional war against Spain was just the beginning. What followed was a brutal 3-year guerrilla conflict between American forces and Filipino independence fighters that would kill hundreds of thousands of people, transform both nations, and establish patterns of American counterinsurgency warfare that persist to this day. This is the story of how the United States, after easily defeating a European colonial power, found itself trapped in an Asian jungle fighting a war it didn't understand against an enemy it couldn't see, using tactics that betrayed American values and achieving a victory that looked more like a stalemate. This is the story of the Philippine-American War, a conflict most Americans have never heard of, but one that reveals fundamental truths about empire, resistance, and the costs of military intervention in foreign lands. The war began not with a surprise attack, but with a series of escalating tensions that made conflict almost inevitable. After defeating Spain, the United States had to decide what to do with the Philippines. President William McKinley, after what he described as prayerful consideration, decided that America would keep the islands as a colony. The Treaty of Paris in December 1898 officially transferred the Philippines from Spain to the United States for $20 million. But there was a problem with this transaction. The Philippines weren't Spain's to sell anymore. Filipino revolutionaries led by Emilio Aguinaldo had defeated Spanish forces throughout the archipelago and had declared independence in June 1898. They controlled virtually the entire country except for Manila, where American troops were stationed. They had written a constitution, established a government, and considered themselves an independent nation. The United States buying the Philippines from Spain was like someone selling your house to a stranger without your permission. The Filipinos had good reason to expect American support for their independence. American officials in Hong Kong had met with Aguinaldo before he returned to the Philippines and, according to Aguinaldo's account, had promised American support for Filipino independence. The United States was fighting to free Cuba from Spanish rule. American rhetoric was full of anti-colonial language and references to America's own revolution against British colonialism. Filipino leaders studied American history and modeled their constitution partly on the U.S. Constitution. They thought America would be different from European colonial powers, that America would understand and support their desire for freedom. They were wrong. The months between August 1898 and February 1899 were a tense standoff. American forces controlled Manila and were reinforced by thousands of additional troops arriving from the United States. Filipino forces surrounded the city, controlling the rest of Luzon and most of the other islands. The two armies faced each other across increasingly hostile lines. American soldiers, many of them volunteers from Western states, treated Filipinos with open racism and contempt. They used the same slurs they used for Native Americans and African Americans. They saw Filipinos as racially inferior, as barely human, as people incapable of self-government who should be grateful for American rule. The Filipinos, watching their independence being stolen and seeing themselves treated with such disrespect, grew angrier by the day. Fighting began on the night of February 4, 1899. An American patrol encountered Filipino soldiers on the San Juan Bridge on the outskirts of Manila. There was a confrontation, someone fired a shot, and within minutes both sides were shooting at each other. By morning, fighting had spread along the entire American perimeter around Manila. Each side blamed the other for starting the war, but the war was probably inevitable given the fundamental incompatibility of American and Filipino goals. The United States was determined to keep the Philippines as a colony. The Filipinos were determined to be independent. Those two positions couldn't be reconciled, so war was the only outcome. The initial phase of the war was conventional military combat between organized armies, and it was a complete mismatch. The American military in 1899 was a modern force with excellent weapons, good training, and superior logistics. They had Springfield rifles that were accurate and reliable. They had artillery, machine guns, and gunboats that could provide fire support along rivers and coastlines. They had a professional officer corps with experience from the Civil War and Indian Wars. Most importantly, they had overwhelming firepower. The Filipino forces under Aguinaldo had some modern rifles, mostly Spanish Mausers captured from Spanish forces, but they had little artillery, no navy, and limited ammunition. They had courage and motivation, but lacked the weapons and training to fight the Americans in conventional battles. The conventional phase of the war lasted roughly from February to November 1899. American forces under General Elwell Otis launched offensives north from Manila, pushing into central Luzon. They won battle after battle, inflicting heavy casualties while suffering relatively few themselves. The pattern was consistent. Filipino forces would take defensive positions, often behind trenches or in towns. American forces would bombard these positions with artillery, then assault with infantry supported by devastating rifle fire. The Filipinos would fight bravely, sometimes counterattacking, but they couldn't withstand the American firepower. They would retreat, regroup, and try to make a stand somewhere else, only to be defeated again. In late March 1899, American forces captured Malolos, which Aguinaldo had made the capital of his Philippine Republic. The capture of Malolos was supposed to end the war. American commanders expected the Filipinos to surrender once their capital was taken, just as conventional armies usually did. But the Filipinos didn't surrender. They just moved their government further north and kept fighting. American forces continued their advance, taking town after town. By November, they had pushed north to San Fernando and were preparing to move even further. Aguinaldo's conventional army had been shattered. His forces were scattered, demoralized, and running out of ammunition. From a conventional military perspective, the Americans had won decisively. But winning battles didn't mean winning the war, because as the Americans were winning the conventional war, the Filipinos were transforming their strategy. Aguinaldo and his commanders recognized they couldn't defeat the Americans in conventional combat. The firepower disparity was too great. Standing and fighting just led to casualties without significant American losses. So they made a strategic decision that would transform the conflict and extend it for years. They disbanded their conventional army and shifted to guerrilla warfare. Instead of fighting as organized units in battles, Filipino soldiers would break into small bands, hide their uniforms, blend into the civilian population, and fight using hit-and-run tactics. They would ambush American patrols, attack supply lines, strike isolated garrisons, and then disappear before American reinforcements could arrive. They would make the occupation so costly and frustrating that Americans would eventually give up and leave. This strategic shift, which happened gradually throughout late 1899 and early 1900, changed everything about the war. Suddenly, the Americans weren't fighting a conventional enemy they could see and target. They were fighting shadows, phantoms, an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere. The man plowing a field during the day might be a guerrilla who attacked American patrols at night. The woman selling fruit in the market might be passing intelligence to the resistance. The village that seemed peaceful might be a guerrilla base. The Americans controlled the towns during the day, but at night the countryside belonged to the guerrillas. It was frustrating, demoralizing, and deadly. The guerrilla strategy worked because it had the support of the Filipino population. This is the crucial factor in any insurgency. Guerrillas need civilians to provide food, shelter, information, and recruits. They need to be able to blend into the population and disappear when necessary. In the Philippines, the guerrillas had this support because most Filipinos wanted independence and saw the Americans as foreign occupiers. Villages would feed guerrillas, warn them when American patrols were coming, hide them when necessary, and refuse to provide information to the Americans. This popular support made the guerrillas extremely difficult to defeat because eliminating them required eliminating or controlling the entire population that supported them. American commanders recognized this problem and developed a counterinsurgency strategy aimed at separating the guerrillas from the population. If they couldn't destroy the guerrillas directly, they would destroy the support system that sustained them. This led to increasingly harsh tactics that targeted not just guerrilla fighters, but the civilian population. The American strategy had several components, each brutal in its own way, and together they amounted to a campaign of systematic devastation aimed at making continued resistance impossible. The first component was concentration. Taking a lesson from Spanish tactics in Cuba that Americans had previously condemned as barbaric, U.S. forces began forcing Filipino civilians into designated concentration zones. The military called them protected zones or concentration areas, trying to avoid the negative connotations, but they were concentration camps. Civilians in areas where guerrilla activity was significant were ordered to move into these designated zones. Anyone found outside the zones could be assumed to be a guerrilla or guerrilla supporter and could be shot on sight. The zones themselves were often overcrowded, unsanitary, and desperately short of food and clean water. Diseases like cholera and malaria swept through them. Thousands died from disease, starvation, and exposure. The goal wasn't to protect civilians, despite the name. It was to deny guerrillas access to the population and resources they needed to survive. The second component was destruction of resources. American forces systematically destroyed anything that might help guerrillas. They burned crops, particularly rice fields and food stores. They killed or confiscated livestock. They burned villages suspected of supporting guerrillas. They destroyed boats that guerrillas might use for transportation. The goal was to create a wasteland where guerrillas couldn't find food or supplies. The strategy was based on the logic that if you make the civilian population suffer enough, they'll stop supporting the guerrillas. In practice, it just created mass starvation and suffering while often strengthening resistance by giving people more reason to hate the occupiers. The third component was aggressive patrolling and military operations aimed at hunting down guerrilla bands. American forces conducted constant patrols, searching for guerrillas, investigating reports of guerrilla activity, and trying to disrupt guerrilla operations. These patrols were dangerous work. Guerrillas knew the terrain, could set up ambushes, and could disappear before reinforcements arrived. American soldiers on patrol were always tense, always expecting an attack, and that tension often led to overreaction. Patrols would shoot at suspicious movements, fire at people running away, assume anyone who didn't immediately cooperate was an enemy. Innocent civilians died regularly in these patrols because soldiers couldn't distinguish between guerrillas and farmers, between threats and frightened people. The fourth component was the systematic use of torture and harsh interrogation to extract intelligence. The water cure, which we now call waterboarding, became routine. Prisoners or civilians suspected of knowing about guerrilla activities would be tortured to force them to provide information. The military officially prohibited torture, but in practice it was widespread and often encouraged by officers who needed intelligence and didn't care how they got it. Other forms of torture were also common. Prisoners were beaten. They were subjected to stress positions. They were threatened with execution. The information gained from torture was often unreliable because people will say anything to stop pain, but the practice continued because it gave the illusion of action and because it served to terrorize the population. The fifth component was summary execution and harsh punishment. The official rules said prisoners should be treated according to the laws of war, but in practice, many guerrillas who were captured were simply shot. Civilians suspected of supporting guerrillas faced harsh punishment. Village leaders were held responsible for guerrilla activity in their areas and could be imprisoned or executed if they didn't provide information or prevent attacks. The message was clear: cooperating with guerrillas would result in death or suffering, while cooperating with Americans might offer safety. It was a protection racket enforced with violence. These tactics were applied across the Philippines, but with varying intensity depending on local commanders. Some American officers tried to follow the rules, treated civilians decently, and built schools and infrastructure to win hearts and minds. Others embraced brutal tactics and saw terrorism as the most effective approach. The result was a patchwork of policies, with some areas experiencing relatively benign occupation, while others experienced systematic devastation. But even in the best-case scenarios, the fundamental reality was military occupation against the will of the population, and that reality undermined any positive efforts. The guerrilla tactics the Filipinos used were sophisticated and effective within their limitations. Guerrilla commanders developed intelligence networks that kept them informed of American movements. They had couriers who passed messages between guerrilla bands. They established supply networks that acquired food, weapons, and ammunition from sympathetic civilians. They conducted propaganda campaigns to maintain popular support and undermine American legitimacy. They enforced discipline on their own fighters and on civilians, executing those suspected of collaboration with Americans. They organized their forces into small, mobile units that could strike quickly and disperse. They chose their targets carefully, attacking vulnerable patrols and isolated garrisons while avoiding well-defended positions. They used terrain to their advantage, operating in mountains and jungles where American forces struggled. They created an alternative government structure in areas they controlled, collecting taxes, administering justice, and providing services, showing that they were a government in waiting, not just a rebel movement. The effectiveness of these guerrilla tactics is shown by the fact that the war dragged on for years despite American military superiority. The Americans controlled the major cities and towns. They won almost every engagement where they could bring their firepower to bear, but they couldn't pacify the countryside. They couldn't stop guerrilla attacks. They couldn't get reliable intelligence because the population wouldn't cooperate. They couldn't tell who was a guerrilla and who was a civilian. Every American soldier in the Philippines was a potential target. Supply convoys had to be heavily guarded. Patrols couldn't venture into contested areas without significant force. Isolated garrisons were constantly at risk of attack. The Americans were trapped in a situation where they had military control but not political legitimacy, and without legitimacy, control required constant force. The human cost of this guerrilla war was staggering, particularly for Filipino civilians who were caught between two forces and suffered from both. The American strategy of resource destruction and concentration camps led to mass starvation and disease. Entire provinces saw their populations decline significantly. The war disrupted agriculture, leading to famines. Trade was disrupted, causing economic collapse. Diseases spread through concentration camps and devastated areas. The most conservative estimates put civilian deaths at around 200,000. More recent scholarship suggests the number might be as high as 750,000 or even 1 million when you include deaths from war-related famine and disease. For context, the Philippine population was only about 7 or 8 million, so losing even 200,000 represents a devastating percentage of the total population. These weren't soldiers dying in combat. These were farmers, fishermen, women, children, elderly people who died from starvation, disease, and violence in a war they didn't start. The impact on American soldiers was also significant, though obviously not on the same scale. About 4,200 American soldiers died in the Philippines, roughly 1,000 in combat, and the rest from disease. Tropical diseases like malaria, dengue, cholera, and dysentery killed far more American soldiers than Filipino bullets did. The Philippines was a harsh environment for Americans not acclimated to the tropics. Diseases that Filipinos had some immunity to devastated American troops. The heat was oppressive. The jungle was difficult terrain. Soldiers suffered from inadequate food, poor sanitation, and the constant stress of guerrilla warfare. Many contracted diseases that affected them for the rest of their lives. The psychological impact was also severe. Fighting a guerrilla war where you can't tell friend from enemy, where ambushes can come anytime, where civilians might be fighters, creates enormous stress. Add to that the moral injury of participating in or witnessing atrocities, of doing things you know are wrong, of seeing terrible suffering, and you have a recipe for lasting trauma. The war also exposed deep divisions in American society about imperialism and America's role in the world. The anti-imperialist movement in the United States used the brutal tactics being employed in the Philippines as evidence that imperialism corrupted American values and turned American soldiers into war criminals. They published soldiers' letters describing atrocities. They brought veterans home to testify about what they had seen and done. They held rallies and published newspapers denouncing the war. Mark Twain wrote scathing essays comparing American actions in the Philippines to European imperialism and suggesting America had betrayed its founding principles. The anti-imperialists argued that a republic couldn't hold colonies without ceasing to be a republic, that the violence necessary to maintain colonial rule was incompatible with American democracy and human rights. Pro-imperialist voices defended the war and the tactics being used. They argued that Filipinos were racially inferior and incapable of self-government, that American rule would civilize and uplift them, that the Philippines were strategically valuable, and that harsh tactics were necessary against a savage enemy who didn't fight by civilized rules. They accused anti-imperialists of undermining American soldiers and encouraging the enemy. They said critics sitting safely at home couldn't understand the necessities of fighting guerrillas. They argued that American colonial rule would eventually benefit Filipinos by bringing education, economic development, and modern government. This debate played out in newspapers, in Congress, in churches, and in homes across America. It was one of the major political issues of the era, though it ultimately didn't change policy because the decision to keep the Philippines had already been made. The Senate held hearings in 1902 investigating allegations of atrocities in the Philippines. Soldiers testified about the water cure, about burning villages, about killing civilians, about harsh policies. Officers tried to justify these tactics as necessary measures against guerrilla warfare. The hearings created a scandal and led to some courts-martial, but the punishments were generally light and the policies largely continued. The hearings showed that the military and political establishments were committed to winning the war regardless of the methods required, and that accountability for atrocities would be minimal. The geography of the Philippines made the guerrilla war particularly challenging for American forces. The Philippines consists of more than 7,000 islands, though only a few hundred are significantly inhabited. The terrain varies from coastal plains to mountains to dense jungle. There were few roads, and most transportation was by water or foot trail. This fragmented geography meant that controlling one area didn't give you control of adjacent areas. Guerrillas could operate on one island while Americans controlled another. They could retreat into mountains where Americans couldn't easily follow. They could use boats to move between islands faster than American forces could respond. The Americans needed to establish garrisons throughout the archipelago, spreading their forces thin and creating numerous vulnerable positions that guerrillas could attack. Different regions of the Philippines also had different dynamics. Luzon, the main island where Manila is located, saw the most intense fighting because it had the largest population and was the center of Filipino political organization. The Americans focused their efforts on Luzon, pushing north to pursue Aguinaldo and his government. The Visayan Islands in the center of the archipelago had their own guerrilla movements that operated somewhat independently. Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago in the south, which were predominantly Muslim, had never been fully controlled by Spain and resisted American rule even more fiercely than the North. The Moro Wars, as the American military called the fighting in the Muslim South, continued until 1913, more than a decade after the official end of the Philippine-American War. This regional diversity meant that the war played out differently in different areas, and that pacifying one region didn't mean pacifying others. The turning point in the war came in March 1901, when American forces captured Emilio Aguinaldo through a clever intelligence operation. American forces had been trying to capture or kill Aguinaldo for years, knowing that his capture would be a major blow to the resistance. In March 1901, they intercepted a message that revealed the location of Aguinaldo's headquarters in northern Luzon. General Frederick Funston organized a daring raid. He took a small force of American soldiers and Filipino scouts who were working for the Americans, some of them former guerrillas who had switched sides. They posed as guerrilla reinforcements, with the Americans pretending to be prisoners. This deception allowed them to get close to Aguinaldo's camp without raising suspicion. They infiltrated the camp and captured Aguinaldo without a major fight. It was a bloodless coup that ended the conventional leadership of the Philippine resistance. In captivity, Aguinaldo issued a proclamation calling on his followers to accept American sovereignty and end the fighting. His statement said that continuing the struggle was futile, that the Americans had proven their power, and that cooperation offered the best path forward for the Filipino people. This proclamation had a significant impact. Many guerrilla commanders and fighters, seeing that their president had surrendered and called for peace, laid down their weapons. Some did so reluctantly, feeling betrayed by Aguinaldo's surrender. Others were exhausted and welcomed a chance to stop fighting. Still others calculated that they could achieve more through political cooperation with the Americans than through continued armed resistance. But the capture of Aguinaldo and his proclamation didn't end the war. Many guerrilla units continued fighting, either because they rejected Aguinaldo's authority to surrender on their behalf, or because they remained committed to independence regardless of what their former president said. Some of the most intense and brutal fighting of the war happened after Aguinaldo's capture, including the Balangiga massacre in September 1901 and the devastating American retaliation on Samar. Regional commanders in different parts of the Philippines continued resistance for months or years after Aguinaldo's surrender. The war that had begun as a centrally organized resistance movement had devolved into numerous local insurgencies, each operating with some independence and each needing to be defeated or negotiated with separately. The American strategy after Aguinaldo's capture combined continued military pressure with increasing efforts at political accommodation. The military continued aggressive counterinsurgency operations, particularly in areas where resistance remained strong. But the civilian government that was being established, headed by William Howard Taft as the first American Governor-General, began implementing reforms aimed at winning Filipino cooperation. The Americans established a more structured civil government, began involving Filipinos in governance at local and eventually regional levels, expanded educational opportunities with English-language schools, built infrastructure like roads and bridges, reformed the legal system, and made promises about eventual self-government. This carrot-and-stick approach, combining ongoing military operations with political reforms and economic development, gradually eroded support for continued armed resistance. The official end of the war came on July 4, 1902, when President Theodore Roosevelt declared victory and granted amnesty to most remaining guerrillas. Roosevelt, who had become president after McKinley's assassination in September 1901, wanted to declare the Philippines pacified and move on. The declaration was somewhat premature because fighting continued in several areas, particularly in the Muslim South, where it would continue for another decade. But for the main islands and the majority of the population, organized armed resistance had ended by mid-1902. The combination of military defeat, exhaustion, the capture of major leaders, and the promise of political participation and economic opportunities led most Filipinos to accept American rule, at least for the time being. But accepting American rule didn't mean liking it or believing it was legitimate. It meant recognizing that continued armed resistance was futile and costly. The Filipino people had fought for years and suffered enormously. The guerrilla strategy hadn't led to American withdrawal. Instead, it had led to devastation and the deaths of hundreds of thousands. Continuing the fight meant more suffering with no realistic prospect of victory. So most Filipinos chose to stop fighting and see what American rule would actually mean, hoping to preserve what they could of their culture and society and work toward independence through political means rather than military resistance. The lessons of the Philippine-American War, particularly the guerrilla phase, are numerous and many remain relevant. First, the war showed that military superiority doesn't guarantee victory in counterinsurgency. The United States had better weapons, better training, and overwhelming firepower, but these advantages weren't decisive against guerrillas who avoided direct confrontation and relied on popular support. Winning battles didn't mean winning the war because the nature of guerrilla warfare is that there are no decisive battles, just an ongoing contest for control and legitimacy. Second, the war showed that harsh tactics and brutality against civilians tend to be counterproductive in counterinsurgency. The American strategy of concentration camps, resource destruction, and collective punishment created enormous suffering but didn't break Filipino resistance. In many cases, it strengthened resistance by creating more grievances and more reasons to fight. The only kind of tactics that might have worked would have been so brutal, essentially genocide, that even the American military in 1900 couldn't fully embrace them, though General Jacob Smith came close on Samar. The war showed that there are limits to what military force can achieve against a determined population fighting for independence. Third, the war showed the crucial importance of political legitimacy in counterinsurgency. The Americans never achieved genuine political legitimacy in the Philippines during the war years. They were foreign occupiers ruling against the will of the population. Without legitimacy, they had to maintain control through constant force, which was expensive, exhausting, and incomplete. The Americans eventually achieved some measure of legitimacy through reforms, education, and gradual inclusion of Filipinos in governance. But this took decades, and even then, the desire for genuine independence never disappeared. Fourth, the war showed how racism enables atrocity and undermines counterinsurgency. The racist attitudes of American soldiers and policymakers made it easier to dehumanize Filipinos and treat them with cruelty. But racism also prevented Americans from understanding Filipino society, from building genuine relationships with the population, from recognizing the legitimacy of Filipino nationalism. The racism that made harsh tactics psychologically acceptable also made those tactics less effective by increasing Filipino resentment and resistance. Fifth, the war showed the difficulty of distinguishing between combatants and civilians in guerrilla warfare. This problem has plagued every counterinsurgency since. When guerrillas don't wear uniforms, when they blend into the civilian population, when civilians support guerrillas willingly or under coercion, how do you fight the guerrillas without attacking civilians? The American answer in the Philippines was often to treat all Filipinos as potential enemies, which meant innocent civilians suffered. But there was no good alternative within the framework of military occupation against popular will. Sixth, the war showed how guerrilla warfare extends conflicts and increases casualties, particularly civilian casualties. The conventional phase of the Philippine-American War lasted about 9 months and resulted in tens of thousands of deaths, mostly Filipino soldiers. The guerrilla phase lasted 3 more years and resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths, mostly Filipino civilians. Guerrilla warfare is devastating for civilians because the tactics used by both sides, guerrilla attacks from within the civilian population and counterinsurgency measures targeting the support base, put civilians in the crossfire. Seventh, the war showed the limits of military intelligence in hostile environments. Despite years of effort, thousands of soldiers, and the use of torture and harsh interrogation, the Americans never developed reliable intelligence about guerrilla activities. The population wouldn't cooperate. The guerrillas had good operational security. The Americans couldn't distinguish between accurate information and deliberate misinformation. Fighting blind is an enormous disadvantage in counterinsurgency, and it's almost impossible to avoid when the population is hostile. Eighth, the war showed how military occupation corrupts both the occupied and the occupiers. The Filipinos were forced into collaboration or resistance, with families and communities torn apart by these choices. Those who collaborated with Americans were seen as traitors by resistance supporters. Those who supported the resistance risked American retaliation. The social fabric was shredded by years of this pressure. The Americans were corrupted in different ways. Soldiers who might have been decent people at home became casual about violence and suffering. Officers compromised their principles to achieve military objectives. The institutions that were supposed to enforce rules and maintain discipline looked the other way when atrocities occurred. Both societies were damaged by the occupation, though obviously the occupied suffered more. Ninth, the war showed the gap between stated ideals and actual behavior. The United States claimed to be bringing civilization, democracy, and freedom to the Philippines. The actual implementation involved concentration camps, torture, mass killing of civilians, and authoritarian military rule. This gap between rhetoric and reality is common in imperial projects, but it was particularly stark in the Philippines because American anti-colonial rhetoric was so prominent and because the atrocities were so severe. The gap undermined American credibility and created cynicism that persisted for generations. Tenth, the war showed patterns that would repeat in future American conflicts. The village pacification programs in Vietnam looked remarkably like the tactics used in the Philippines. The strategic Hamlet program was essentially the same as the concentration camps. The use of torture in the War on Terror echoed the water cure. The difficulty of fighting insurgents in Iraq and Afghanistan repeated the same problems American forces faced in the Philippines a century earlier. The Pentagon studied the Philippine-American War when planning counterinsurgency operations in later conflicts, but somehow the deeper lessons that occupation creates resistance, that harsh tactics backfire, that wars against nationalist movements are nearly impossible to win, didn't stick. The tactical lessons were learned, but the strategic lessons were ignored. The end of the war didn't mean the end of Filipino desire for independence. Throughout the American colonial period, which lasted until 1946, Filipino political movements continued pushing for independence. Some worked within the colonial system, seeking gradual transfer of power. Others organized mass movements. The American colonial government, recognizing that complete suppression was impossible, gradually granted more autonomy and self-government. English language education created a Filipino elite that could navigate both Filipino and American cultures. Economic development created a middle class with stakes in stability. The promise of eventual independence, made repeatedly by American officials, kept many Filipinos willing to work within the system rather than resume armed resistance. But the scars of the war never fully healed. The memory of American torture, of concentration camps, of burned villages and mass starvation remained part of Filipino collective memory. The war became part of Filipino national identity, a story of resistance against overwhelming odds, of suffering under occupation, of fighting for independence. Heroes of the resistance like Aguinaldo, despite his controversial surrender, and regional commanders who fought to the end, became national figures. The war was taught in schools. It was commemorated with monuments. It shaped how Filipinos viewed Americans and how they understood their own history. In the United States, the war was largely forgotten. Most Americans today have never heard of the Philippine-American War. It's barely mentioned in history textbooks. When it's taught at all, it's usually as a brief footnote to the Spanish-American War. The guerrilla phase, where most of the dying happened, is almost completely absent from American historical consciousness. This amnesia is itself significant. It shows how imperial powers forget their colonial wars while the colonized remember them. It shows how uncomfortable histories get buried. It shows the power of collective forgetting in shaping national identity. Americans prefer to remember the Spanish-American War, the quick victory that made America a world power, and forget the messy guerrilla war that followed, the war that revealed the costs and contradictions of empire. The Philippine-American War, particularly its guerrilla phase, deserves to be remembered and studied because it reveals fundamental truths about war, empire, resistance, and human nature. It shows that technological superiority and military might don't guarantee victory when facing determined resistance with popular support. It shows that harsh tactics against civilians are not just morally wrong, but strategically counterproductive. It shows that racism corrupts judgment and undermines strategy. It shows that guerrilla warfare is devastating for civilians who become targets for both sides. It shows that military occupation without political legitimacy is unsustainable and requires constant force to maintain. It shows the gap between national ideals and national actions, between what countries say they stand for and what they actually do. And it shows patterns that repeat across time. The same challenges facing counterinsurgency forces in the Philippines in 1900, as in Vietnam in 1968 or Afghanistan in 2010. Understanding this war helps us understand American history and American power. The United States became an imperial power in 1898 and has remained one in various forms ever since. The colonial empire was mostly dismantled after World War II, but American power continued to shape events around the world through military interventions, economic influence, and political pressure. The patterns established in the Philippines, the use of military force to advance American interests, the rhetoric of liberation and democracy masking imperial control, the difficulty of counterinsurgency, the use of harsh tactics, all of these recur throughout American history. Understanding the Philippine-American War helps make sense of later conflicts and reveals the continuities in American foreign policy and military strategy. The war also helps us understand the Philippines and Filipino-American relations. The special relationship between the two countries, the millions of Filipino-Americans, the close military ties, the economic connections, all have roots in the colonial relationship established through this war. The relationship is complicated by the history of conquest and resistance, by the memory of atrocities, by the decades of colonial rule. But there's also genuine connection and affection, products of decades of interaction and the reality that many Filipino families have members in America. Understanding the war helps make sense of this complex relationship and the mixed feelings many Filipinos have toward America. The human stories of the war deserve remembering beyond the statistics and strategies. There were American soldiers, mostly young men barely out of their teens, who died of tropical diseases in a country they'd never heard of before being sent there. There were Filipino guerrillas who fought for years, living in jungles, separated from their families, sustained by belief in independence. There were Filipino civilians caught in the middle, trying to survive while armies fought over their villages. There were American officers who struggled with the gap between their ideals and their orders. There were Filipino collaborators who made complicated choices about survival and opportunity. There were acts of courage and acts of cruelty, moments of compassion and moments of horror. All of these individual stories made up the larger story of the war. The guerrilla war in the Philippines from 1899 to 1902 was one of America's first major counterinsurgency campaigns and one of its most brutal. It established patterns and precedents that would shape American military operations for over a century. It showed both the power and the limits of American military force. It revealed contradictions between American ideals and American actions. It resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths, mostly Filipino civilians, in a war that most Americans today have never heard of. It deserves to be studied, taught, and remembered, not to shame America, but to understand America, to learn from mistakes rather than repeat them, to honor the dead by acknowledging their suffering, and to think more carefully about the costs of military intervention and the complexities of war.